Emma adjusted her as Flight 427 began its ascent from Chicago, the city shrinking beneath a haze of afternoon sunlight. She stared out the small oval window at the endless expanse of clouds, feeling a familiar flutter of nervous anticipation. Air travel had always been a mixture of thrill and unease for her. Engineers often noticed the tiny details others ignored: the subtle whir of engines, the rhythmic hum of the cabin pressure, the faint vibration beneath her feet. Most passengers dismissed these signs, but Emma could not. She reached for her notebook, flipping to a page filled with scribbles about her latest home project, a mechanical device she had been tinkering with for weeks. The hum of the engines, the occasional bump of turbulence, even the distant chatter of flight attendants felt oddly comforting. To anyone watching, she was just another passenger, quietly lost in her own world, headphones in, notebook on her lap. But beneath that calm exterior was a mind tuned to patterns, systems, and mechanics, a mind that would soon become the difference between disaster and survival. The cabin was lively with the low murmur of conversations. Families chatted, children giggled and pointed at passing clouds, couples whispered plans for vacations, and business travelers typed furiously on laptops. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, smiling and reassuring nervous passengers. Emma glanced briefly at them, noticing the meticulous coordination in their every step, the practiced ease of people who did this every day. She admired their professionalism but felt removed from it, a quiet observer. As the plane climbed steadily, Emma reflected on her journey to Ohio. She was traveling to see her grandparents, who had recently celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. Family reunions had always been a mix of warmth and mild chaos, and she anticipated both with a smile. The thought of the familiar faces waiting at the other end of the flight gave her comfort, a sense of purpose beyond her usual routine of work, coffee, and late-night tinkering in her home workshop. Minutes passed and the plane reached cruising altitude. Emma tapped her pen against the notebook absent-mindedly, sketching tiny gears and circuits, her mind wandering yet alert. Something about the plane's engine note felt slightly off, though she could not pinpoint it. It was barely perceptible, a fraction of a second out of rhythm, a subtle shift in vibration. She noted it quietly, dismissing it as overthinking, yet her instincts told her to pay attention. She looked around, watching the passengers. Most were immersed in phones, books, or conversation, oblivious to minor irregularities that might hint at larger issues. She caught sight of a young boy gripping his father's arm tightly, eyes wide with unease. The father smiled reassuringly, ruffling the boy's hair. Emma felt a pang of empathy, imagining the fear they might feel if the ordinary flight became anything less than smooth. She mentally vowed to stay observant, even if nothing happened. The flight attendants moved down the aisle, checking and offering water and snacks. Their professional smiles never faltered, but Emma noticed small signs of alertness in their glances toward the cockpit. Nothing overt, but enough to signal that even experienced crew could sense subtle variations in a plane's behavior. Her curiosity piqued. She listened closely to the faint hums and mechanical rhythms around her. As the plane leveled off, sunlight streaming through the windows, everything seemed deceptively normal. The engines purred steadily, the cabin lights glowed warmly, and passengers settled into their routines. Emma leaned back in her seat, notebook forgotten for a moment, and allowed herself to relax. Little did she know, the ordinary hum of Flight 427 was about to be interrupted. The ordinary afternoon, filled with the mundane rituals of travel, was about to give way to an extraordinary moment, one that would transform Emma from a quiet passenger into the of heroes. Emma had just settled back into her seat, notebook open again, when the first tremors of turbulence rippled through the cabin. At first, they were slight, barely noticeable, a gentle jolt that made her pen skip across the page. The plane's wings flexed gracefully against the sky, and the passengers barely flinched, trusting the machine to carry them safely. Yet, Emma's sharp eyes and trained mind noticed something that most would have ignored: a faint, irregular vibration running through the fuselage, slightly out of sync with the engine hum. The turbulence intensified suddenly, jerking the plane as if it had hit an invisible wall. Drinks toppled over in cups, and a few nervous murmurs rippled through the cabin. The flight attendants gripped the seat backs as their smiles strained, their professional calm slightly cracking under the unexpected jolt. Emma's heart rate quickened, not in fear but in alertness. Her instincts told her this was not normal turbulence. Something in the timing, the vibration, the way the plane shivered, it all signaled a problem beneath the surface. She glanced at the overhead compartments as a few passengers whispered hurriedly to each other. A young mother clutched her child tightly, murmuring reassurance she barely felt herself. Emma's eyes shifted to the cockpit briefly, catching the pilot's reflection in the window. Their posture was tense, hands gripping controls a little more tightly than usual. Though still composed, they were reacting to something not entirely ordinary. The red light of minor alerts blinked faintly on the instrument panel, subtle, almost imperceptible. To Emma, with her analytical eye, the signs were enough to raise concern. As the turbulence continued, Emma instinctively tuned into the mechanical rhythms. Each engine thrum, each wing flex, each vibration became a signal. She compared it mentally to every technical scenario she had ever studied: emergency procedures, mechanical stress points, and system redundancies. She realized the autopilot was likely struggling to compensate for a minor malfunction. But what if it worsened? What if this turbulence exposed something deeper, something catastrophic? The thought made her stomach tighten, but it also sharpened her focus. She could not ignore it. A sudden jolt threw her notebook from her lap, sliding it under the seat in front. Emma crouched to retrieve it, her mind racing as she scanned the cabin. Panic was starting to spread. A few passengers screamed softly. Some gripped the armrests as if they could physically anchor themselves. Flight attendants moved swiftly, trying to calm the passengers, repeating the standard assurances. "It's just turbulence. Please remain seated." But Emma could see it. Their practice calm was strained, their eyes flicking toward the cockpit more frequently than protocol required. Then came the first audible warning, a faint but insistent beep from the cockpit. Emma's attention snapped instantly. She had never been inside a cockpit during an emergency, yet her knowledge of systems allowed her to interpret the signs. Electrical fluctuations, minor hydraulic anomalies, or sensor misreads, anyone could explain it, yet the combination unsettled her. The autopilot might disengage at any moment, leaving the pilots to manually control a plane thousands of feet above the earth. The thought made her pulse quicken, but it also awakened a strange determination. Emma noticed the passengers around her, oblivious to the technical warning signals. A teenage boy stared out the window, pale, while his mother muttered softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. Anxiety rippled quietly, a collective tension that seemed to swell with every jolt. Emma's analytical mind raced. The plane's descent, the subtle engine vibration, the blinking cockpit lights, everything indicated a potential escalation. She had to be ready. Something deep inside her whispered, "Pay attention. Something is coming, and you might be the only one who notices." As the plane shook again, slightly harder this time, Emma sat upright, steeling herself. The ordinary flight she had expected, filled with routine and minor comforts, was no longer ordinary. The hum of engines, the chatter of passengers, and the gentle light through the windows, all seemed suddenly fragile, temporary. Somewhere up ahead, in the invisible airspace above clouds, the first threads of danger were knitting themselves into a pattern, and Emma, quiet and observant, was the first to see them clearly. The moment had arrived when being a passenger would no longer be enough. The plane shuddered violently, louder than any turbulence Emma had ever experienced. Alarms shrieked from the cockpit, a harsh, mechanical chorus that pierced the murmurs of panic spreading through the cabin. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling like strange, plastic ghosts as passengers fumbled to secure them. Emma's heart pounded, but fear did not paralyze her. Instead, her mind sharpened, analyzing every detail. The subtle tilt of the wings, the stutter of the engines, the erratic flashes on the cockpit panel she glimpsed through the small window. Something critical had gone wrong. The autopilot had failed completely. The plane lurched unpredictably, forcing the pilots to wrestle with controls that no longer responded smoothly. The first officer's knuckles whitened as he gripped the yoke, his jaw tight with concentration. The captain barked orders, trying to stabilize the aircraft manually. Each adjustment seemed to invite another jolt, another shudder, another heart-stopping dip. Passengers screamed or clutched the seats in front of them. Drinks spilled, phones flew from laps, and panic began to ripple outward like waves in water. Emma's instincts told her this was no longer ordinary turbulence. This was life or death. Emma's analytical mind raced. She had read about these scenarios: engine failure, electrical malfunction, sudden autopilot disengagement, but reading about them was nothing like living them. She noticed subtle clues others missed. The hum of one engine was uneven, and a faint electrical flicker ran across the panel lights. She realized that if the pilots couldn't stabilize the plane, the consequences could be catastrophic. Emma's throat tightened, but her focus sharpened. She couldn't panic. She couldn't sit idle. Every second counted. From her vantage point, she watched the passengers around her. A young girl clutched her mother, tears streaming down her face. An elderly man muttered prayers under his breath. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, their calm training battling the rising fear that threatened to overwhelm them. Emma's gaze returned to the cockpit. The pilots, though highly skilled, were clearly struggling with a complex mechanical failure. She felt an unusual, almost inexplicable urge to step forward. Her background in engineering, years of solving impossible problems, flashed through her mind. Maybe, just maybe, she could help. She stood slowly, navigating through the now chaotic cabin. Passengers watched her uncertainly, some with curiosity, others with fear. She approached the cockpit door, her voice firm but calm as she called out, "I have experience with mechanical systems. Maybe I can help." The captain's eyes widened in disbelief. We have it under control," he said, but there was hesitation, a subtle acknowledgement that they were struggling. The second officer glanced at her, weighing the risk of letting a passenger near the controls. The turbulence rocked the plane again, harder this time. Something in Emma's expression, calm, focused, determined, must have convinced the captain. With a tense nod, he opened the cockpit door just enough to allow her in. Emma stepped inside, her eyes scanning the panels, the flickering lights, the unsteady readings. Every instinct screamed urgency. Every calculation in her mind raced to match the rhythm of the plane. She was no longer just a passenger. She was now in the cockpit, standing at the edge of disaster, ready to act. A violent shudder threw her slightly off balance, and the plane's nose dipped sharply. Passengers screamed. Flight attendants shouted instructions. Emma gritted her teeth, steadying herself, and looked directly at the pilots. "Let's stabilize it," she said simply. It was all she could do for now: assess, prioritize, and act. The ordinary flight she had boarded hours earlier was gone. In its place was a machine on the edge of chaos, and a woman who had stepped forward, calm in the eye of a storm, ready to seize control. Emma's heart pounded, but her mind was a precise machine, processing every instrument, every dial, every flicker of light. The plane rocked violently again, and the alarms blared like warning bells in a nightmare. The pilots were skilled, but even they struggled against the unpredictable movements of the aircraft. Emma realized that simply observing was no longer enough. She had to act. Every second counted. Hesitation could cost lives. "Let me help," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the chaos. The captain's eyes widened, clearly weighing the unusual offer. There was disbelief, hesitation, and then a flicker of hope. With a subtle nod, he moved slightly aside, allowing her closer to the controls. Emma's palms itched to touch the instruments, to make calculations, to stabilize the plane. She was just a passenger, but this ordinary woman was about to make extraordinary choices. Emma scanned the cockpit. The autopilot was offline, engine readings were inconsistent, and warning lights blinked in rapid succession. She memorized the layout quickly, noting which dials required attention, which switches could compensate for failing hydraulics, and which emergency systems could be deployed. She knew nothing could replace the pilot's training, but her technical knowledge and quick reasoning could at least buy precious minutes. She positioned herself carefully, gripping a stabilizer as another violent shudder rolled through the cabin. The first officer's voice broke the tension. "We might lose the left engine if this continues. We need to adjust immediately." Emma nodded, her mind already calculating the necessary compensations. She guided the pilot verbally, suggesting subtle adjustments to throttle and balance. Her tone was calm, authoritative, not demanding but precise. The captain looked at her incredulously, but as Emma's instructions helped steady the plane slightly, disbelief turned into cautious trust. She was ordinary, yet in these critical moments, her clarity and focus were indispensable. Outside, clouds churned violently, a dark, roiling sea of white and gray. Inside, the cabin quivered with each gust of wind, passengers clutching armrests, eyes wide with terror. Emma glanced at them briefly, then returned her attention to the cockpit. She was no longer a bystander. Each action she suggested, each small adjustment became a lifeline for everyone aboard. Her thoughts were rapid but precise. Stabilize the roll, maintain altitude, prevent further stress on the engines, monitor pressure. Every detail mattered. The plane dipped suddenly and a wave of panic rippled through the cabin. Emma's calm voice cut through the chaos. "Steady, slight right correction, watch the hydraulics." The pilots followed her instructions, their movements tense but synchronized with hers. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft began to level. Relief surged through her briefly, but she knew it was only temporary. One miscalculation, one overlooked gauge could undo everything. She could not afford distraction, fear, or error. Time became a blur, a mix of alarms, engine hums, and rapid calculations. Emma's focus never wavered. The ordinary passenger she had been hours ago, someone quietly sketching gears in a notebook, was gone. In her place was a decisive, analytical presence, guiding trained pilots with calm precision in the midst of chaos. She had crossed the invisible threshold from passenger to potential savior. The moment of decision was complete. She would act, and her actions might save dozens of lives. The turbulence eased slightly, giving a false sense of calm. Emma knew better. The plane was stabilized for now, but the crisis was far from over. Every passenger, unaware of her precise role, sensed only that the storm had passed momentarily. Emma, though exhausted, remained alert, her mind racing ahead, anticipating the next threat. She had stepped into a world of uncertainty where ordinary courage and quick thinking were the only weapons, and she would not falter. Emma's fingers hovered over the controls, every nerve alert, every instinct focused. The plane still quivered unpredictably, but she had begun to assess patterns, engine response, wing stability, and minor hydraulic fluctuations. The pilots, though initially skeptical, now followed her lead, adjusting according to her calm, precise directions. The cockpit was a tense orchestra of alarms, switches, and commands, and Emma was suddenly at its center, orchestrating a delicate balance between chaos and control. She took a deep breath, centering herself amid the cacophony. "Throttle adjustment 5% left," she instructed. The captain followed, and the plane steadied fractionally. It was a small victory, but a crucial one. Each correction, each careful tweak, brought the aircraft back from the brink of disaster. Emma felt a strange combination of fear and exhilaration. She was no longer a passenger. She was a critical component of the rescue effort. The cabin continued to shudder, passengers gripping armrests, eyes wide with terror. Many were oblivious to who was guiding the plane to safety, but Emma could feel the weight of their lives pressing down on her shoulders. Every minor miscalculation could escalate into catastrophe. She adjusted her focus, blocking out everything but the controls, the gauges, and the fluctuating readings. Her mind moved in fractions of a second, calculating compensation for engine lag, hydraulic delay, and wind gusts. The plane's nose dipped slightly. Emma leaned forward, tracing the stabilizer's movements and issuing clear commands. "Left rudder, slight correction. Keep altitude steady. Hydraulics are fluctuating, compensate with small pitch adjustments." The pilots, tense but coordinated, executed her instructions. Slowly, the violent oscillations diminished and the aircraft leveled almost imperceptibly. The cockpit was tense, but the teamwork was working. Emma's clarity, her cool-headed analysis, and her decisive action had begun to restore balance. Minutes passed like hours. The storm outside continued to batter the plane, gusts of wind buffeting the fuselage, yet inside, a fragile order had emerged. Emma monitored every dial, every light, her mind running simulations faster than thought itself. She calculated engine stress points, hydraulic pressures, and control surface limitations simultaneously, correcting micro-deviations instantly. Each adjustment brought stability, and each minor success reinforced the fragile hope that the flight could survive. At one point, a violent shudder sent Emma bracing against the console. Her voice remained calm, authoritative. "Hold the trim, steady the ailerons. Watch the left engine, minor throttle increase now." The pilots executed and the plane responded, stabilizing slightly. Emma allowed herself a fleeting thought. She could not fail. Dozens of lives depended on her, and failure was not an option. The ordinary flight she had boarded was gone. The ordinary passenger she had been hours ago was gone. Only the sharp, calculated mind in the cockpit remained. Outside, the clouds churned angrily as if the sky itself resisted their efforts. Inside, Emma guided the plane through micro-adjustments, balancing fear and precision. Her instructions were calm, almost soothing in tone, a contrast to the alarms and turbulence. She had become the anchor in a sea of chaos, a source of steadiness when panic threatened to overwhelm. Each passenger, unaware of her role, sensed only the subtle easing of the ride, not realizing that their lives were being safeguarded by someone they had never expected. Time stretched, but gradually, a fragile equilibrium emerged. The plane was no longer careening wildly, though it was far from safe. Emma's determination, focus, and unyielding calm had transformed a potential disaster into a controlled crisis. She had seized control, not alone, but in perfect coordination with the pilots, turning fear into action, chaos into strategy. For the first time, the thought crossed her mind that survival was possible, but only if she maintained absolute vigilance. The roar of engines and the shriek of alarms filled the cockpit, but Emma's focus never wavered. She leaned forward, monitoring every dial, every gauge, every minor fluctuation. The plane was finally responding to her adjustments, but the task ahead, landing safely, was far more complex. Turbulence had battered the aircraft, some systems were compromised, and every movement had to be precise. A single miscalculation now could undo all the progress they had made. Emma's mind raced, calculating descent angles, thrust compensation, and flaps adjustments simultaneously. The captain looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and cautious trust. "We're entering the approach zone," he said, voice tense. Emma nodded, scanning the instruments. She knew that a controlled descent required perfect coordination between throttles, flaps, and rudder. The autopilot was still offline. Every adjustment had to be manual, every decision exact. She issued clear, concise commands to the pilots, her tone calm yet commanding. "Throttle down gradually, keep the left engine balanced. Watch pitch, minor adjustment now. Prepare flaps incrementally." Below, the patchwork of fields and airport lights appeared through the storm clouds, a fragile line of hope against the turbulent gray. Passengers clutched armrests, some with wide-eyed terror, others muttering prayers under their breath. Emma briefly glanced at them, a surge of determination coursing through her. She could not allow fear to dominate. Every life on board depended on her composure, her focus, and her ability to act decisively in real time. The plane shuddered violently as a sudden gust buffeted the fuselage. Emma's voice remained steady. "Hold the yoke, minor left rudder correction, increase flaps slowly, stabilize altitude, don't..." The pilots responded instantly, hands moving with precision, guided by her instructions. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the aircraft began to align with the runway. Each adjustment was measured, deliberate, a tiny victory against the chaos surrounding them. Back in the cabin, passengers were unaware of who was orchestrating the landing. The sudden calm in the cockpit had subtly transferred to the main cabin. The oxygen masks had been stowed, and murmurs of fear were now mixed with hesitant hope. A young boy peeked from under his mother's arm, sensing the shift, while an elderly man tightened his grip on the seat in front, disbelief in his eyes. Nobody yet understood that an ordinary passenger was the unseen hero guiding them to safety. Emma's mind worked faster than thought itself. She calculated throttle adjustments, monitored wind gusts, and corrected minor shifts in pitch. Maintain heading, slight left correction now. Rudder steady, flaps at 20 degrees. The pilots moving in perfect synchronization with her guidance. Slowly, the runway stretched closer, illuminated faintly through the breaking clouds. Emma could feel the collective breath of everyone aboard, held unknowingly in anticipation. As the landing gear extended, the plane shuddered, and Emma's eyes tracked every gauge, every movement. She instructed the pilots to maintain careful speed, adjusting the descent angle to counteract the turbulent gusts. The aircraft responded to her guidance, nose steadying, wheels approaching the runway. Outside, storm clouds swirled violently, but inside the cockpit, a fragile order prevailed. Every calculation, every adjustment, every command was leading them closer to safety. Finally, the tires kissed the tarmac with a controlled jolt, sending vibrations through the cabin. Emma's voice remained calm, guiding the plane through the final meters. Reduce throttle, steady brakes, hold the rudder, slow gradually. The plane rolled along the runway, its momentum finally tamed. Relief surged through the cabin as passengers clutched each other, tears and applause mingling in a chaotic celebration of survival. Emma remained focused until the aircraft came to a complete stop. Only then did she allow herself a fleeting sense of triumph. She had helped orchestrate the impossible, guiding the plane and its passengers through one of the most perilous situations imaginable. She had turned panic into control, chaos into order. The rescue was complete, but the reality of what had happened was just beginning to sink in. The plane had come to a complete stop, and the hum of the engines gradually faded into an uneasy silence. Emma slumped slightly in her seat, muscles tight from hours of tension, but her eyes remained alert. Around her, passengers slowly began to comprehend what had just occurred. Relief mingled with disbelief. Many clutched their loved ones, tears streaming down faces previously pale with fear. Some whispered prayers of gratitude, others hugged neighbors they barely knew. The cabin was a mixture of exhaustion, shock, and overwhelming relief. The flight attendants, professional and calm throughout, finally allowed themselves small signs of release. One began to move down the aisle, reassuring passengers, distributing water and offering gentle smiles. "You're safe now," she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. Emma noticed their glances toward the cockpit, and it was in those looks that she realized how extraordinary the situation had been. Her presence there, guiding the pilots, had been invisible to most but vital for everyone. The pilots removed their headsets and exchanged a glance heavy with gratitude and disbelief. The captain finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Everyone, this plane landed safely thanks to a passenger in our midst. Please join me in acknowledging Emma." A wave of applause erupted throughout the cabin. Emma, still processing, felt the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She had acted out of instinct and knowledge, never seeking recognition, but the acknowledgement of her bravery brought a mixture of humility and quiet pride. Passengers began to approach her cautiously, some shaking her hand, others hugging her. "You saved us," a mother whispered, clutching her child tightly. "We would have, I don't even want to think," an elderly man said, voice trembling. Emma smiled softly, words failing her. She had only done what her mind dictated, acting logically in the midst of chaos. Yet the gratitude, the relief, the emotional weight in the cabin, it was overwhelming. She realized that her ordinary life had intersected with extraordinary circumstances, leaving her forever changed. News crews were already gathering at the gate, eager to cover the miraculous landing. Cameras and microphones filled the cabin moments later. Emma answered questions carefully, her voice calm and measured. She explained her background in engineering, how she had noticed subtle anomalies in the plane's behavior, and how she had coordinated with the pilots to stabilize the aircraft. Journalists scribbled notes frantically, captivated by the story of the unassuming woman who had become the plane's savior. Her composure impressed even the most seasoned reporters. The pilots, visibly moved, spoke openly about their initial hesitation. "We were struggling, and we didn't know if we could make it," the captain admitted. "Emma stepped in, guided us, and helped bring everyone down safely. Without her, this could have ended very differently." The crew nodded in agreement, their respect for Emma palpable. Even passengers who had initially dismissed her as just another traveler now saw her as something far greater, an ordinary person performing an extraordinary act. As the crowd thinned and passengers disembarked, Emma remained reflective. She watched families reunite, children laugh nervously, and friends embrace tightly. She felt a mixture of relief and disbelief herself. Just hours ago, she had been an ordinary passenger, unaware that her keen observation skills, technical knowledge, and calm under pressure would be needed in the most critical moment of her life. Her ordinary existence had intersected with extraordinary circumstances, creating a story that would be told for years. By the time the last passenger stepped off the plane, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. Emma had faced the impossible and acted decisively, saving dozens of lives. She had crossed the threshold from observer to hero, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. The story of the flight would spread quickly, inspiring awe, admiration, and reflection. Emma had become a symbol of courage, proving that ordinary people can perform extraordinary acts when faced with unimaginable challenges. Weeks after Flight 427's emergency landing, Emma found herself in a quiet corner of her Ohio apartment, the hum of everyday life feeling almost surreal. The memory of the flight, its alarms, turbulence, and the sense of imminent disaster remained vivid in her mind. She had returned to ordinary routines: coffee in the morning, long hours at the engineering firm, tinkering in her workshop. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. She carried the weight of knowing she had been the difference between life and death for dozens of strangers. News stories, interviews, and social media posts had chronicled her extraordinary actions. Emma had become, almost overnight, a symbol of courage and quick thinking. People across the country praised her calm and intelligence, amazed that an ordinary passenger had stepped into a cockpit under extreme duress and helped land a plane safely. Yet she remained humble. To her, she had only acted logically, doing what her training and instincts demanded. She did not think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as someone who had refused to freeze in a crisis. Emma reflected on the passengers' faces, the fleeting glances of relief and gratitude she had seen in the cabin. The mother clutching her child, the elderly man who had whispered a shaky prayer, the teenage boy who had stared wide-eyed at the overhead compartments, all had placed a piece of their survival in her hands. That responsibility had been immense, but it had also revealed a strength she hadn't fully known she possessed. She realized courage often emerges quietly, in moments that demand clarity, focus, and presence of mind. At work, her colleagues noticed subtle changes. She was more confident, decisive, and calm under pressure. Situations that once caused her stress now seemed manageable, almost trivial in comparison. Her extraordinary experience had reshaped her perception of herself and her capabilities. Emma knew that the lessons from the flight were not just about mechanics or engineering. They were about human resilience, composure, and the power of stepping forward when circumstances demanded it. Her family, friends, and even strangers continued to reach out. Messages poured in, expressing gratitude, admiration, and awe. Invitations for interviews, speaking engagements, and appearances arrived, each one recounting the story of Flight 427 and the woman who had changed its outcome. Emma often declined public appearances, preferring quiet reflection, yet she could not ignore the impact of her actions. She had inspired people without even intending to, showing that heroism can emerge from the most ordinary among us. Emma also thought about the pilots, the trust they had placed in her, the willingness to allow a passenger into the cockpit during a life-threatening emergency had been remarkable. They had acknowledged her contributions publicly, cementing her place in aviation history, not as a pilot, but as a civilian whose calm and intelligence had been indispensable in crisis. She felt deep gratitude for their professionalism and courage, knowing that her actions would never have succeeded without their coordination and skill. Despite the attention, Emma's life gradually returned to its quiet rhythm. Yet she was changed. She now understood that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges, that calm, clarity, and knowledge could become lifelines when fear threatened to dominate, that heroism did not always wear a uniform or occupy the spotlight. It often emerged in the small, decisive choices made when no one else could act. Looking back, Emma realized Flight 427 had altered her forever. She had glimpsed the extraordinary in herself and in humanity. Her story spread far beyond the plane, inspiring strangers, students, and professionals alike. People saw in her a proof that courage is not reserved for the elite. It exists in everyone, waiting for the moment when it must emerge. Emma, once just a passenger, had become a symbol of hope, bravery, and the remarkable power of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The memory of the flight remained vivid, but it no longer haunted her. Instead, it reminded her that even in moments of terror and uncertainty, clarity, courage, and determination could guide the way. Her life had returned to its quiet rhythm, but her legacy, the lives she had saved, the inspiration she had sparked, would endure forever.